Hello, I'm Wayne Brittenden for the Political Compass. On our website, we indicate that hardline attitudes towards crime and punishment are a strong indicator of the authoritarian personality. Both fascist and communist countries have almost always been unswerving in their commitment to the death penalty, and as much of the world swings more away from mainstream political parties towards strident nationalism and all that that represents, we wonder, is the death penalty making a comeback? No one's in a better position to answer that question than Robert Dunham. He's executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center in Washington, D.C.
What we're seeing in the United States, and it's reflected pretty much around the rest of the world as well, is an intensification of feeling about the death penalty, both for the death penalty and against it. Globally, the death penalty is actually on the decline, and it's also on the decline in the United States. But at the same time, there are efforts and rhetoric in many different countries suggesting that the death penalty should be brought back. There is a very strong relationship between nationalism and the death penalty, between xenophobia and trying to exercise the most punishing of all punishments. So it's not surprising that with a rise in nationalism and a rise in hate, you would also see increased efforts or renewed efforts to bring back capital punishment. Now, there's a significant barrier to that happening in Europe, because to be a member of the European Union, you are required to abolish the death penalty. And so nationalist efforts in countries like Germany or France would be defeated by the fact that they are members of the European Union. You cannot be a member of the European Union and have the death penalty. With Great Britain, there are human rights treaties that the country is signatory to that restrict the availability of capital punishment. And so it's more than just fragments of society seeking to bring it back. There are actual legal hurdles to bring it back. You can't just say, I want to have the death penalty and have it back. Now, it's also the case that evidence around the world is showing that everywhere the death penalty is used, it is disproportionately applied against disfavored groups in the society. So you are more likely in the United States to see the death penalty applied in cases where you have white female victims, for example, and disproportionately applied against defendants of color, either defendants who are African American or who are Latino. We see the same phenomenon in every country that practices capital punishment. In Iraq, you see the use of the death penalty disproportionately against Shia political opposition. In Iran, you see it disproportionately against Sunni political opposition. And in Saudi Arabia, we see the death penalty employed against political opponents of the regime and disproportionately against immigrant workers. So it isn't surprising that the death penalty will be mentioned as something that nationalist groups want to bring back. Nationalist groups tend to have political beliefs that nationalist groups tend to have political agendas that are highly discriminatory against immigrant groups and other disfavored segments of society. That's precisely the type of those are precisely the types of groups who get targeted by death penalties across the world.
Also, I think the nationalist ferment is much stronger in the provinces than in the cities. I can imagine that there's more of an appetite for capital punishment in Kentucky than Manhattan.
Well, I think that support for the death penalty does vary regionally in the United States, but the fact of the matter is that wherever you are in the United States, support for the death penalty is actually weakening. Now, I think that with the rhetoric from the current administration in Washington, the more hateful segments of society have been emboldened. And that leads some to be more vocal in saying that they want to seek the death penalty. It makes others more vocal in saying that they want to curtail the ability of the courts to give relief for unconstitutionally imposed convictions and death sentences. But public support for the death penalty has declined dramatically over the course of the last 25 years. In the mid-1990s, as high as 80% of Americans said that they supported capital punishment. Recently, the most recent polls, both by the Pew organization and by Gallup, place support for the death penalty in the mid-50s. That's a drop of 25 percentage points. And when you ask Americans the more policy-oriented question, what do you think is the appropriate punishment for premeditated murder? A majority of Americans say that punishment such as life without parole or a long term in prison is more appropriate than the death penalty. So we haven't seen those numbers changing even with the divisive rhetoric that's coming out of Washington. What we have seen is a hardening of positions both for and against the death penalty. And at the same time that the administration in Washington has sought to expand the scope of the federal death penalty and has sought to create a new execution protocol and carry out executions, states across the country are still moving away from the death penalty. This looks like it will be our fifth straight year in which fewer than 50 death sentences have been imposed and fewer than 30 people are executed. Neither of those had happened for more than a quarter century until we hit this 5-year trend. So support for the death penalty is down nationally. It's down across almost all regions of the United States. The death penalty has disappeared entirely from New England, the far northeast of the United States. There's only one state in the entire Northeast that still has the death penalty, and it hasn't executed anybody who didn't volunteer to give up their rights. New death sentences were at historic lows throughout most of the western United States, and states west of Texas haven't executed anybody since 2014. That leaves the death penalty concentrated in a small set of states in the deep south of the United States.
There is a paradox here, isn't there? Because it's pretty clear that the nations that uphold the death penalty, or states that uphold the death penalty, also have the worst prison conditions. So if you get somebody off death row and into life imprisonment, they're quite likely to attempt suicide in unconscionable conditions.
I don't think that's true. It is true that the states that most aggressively practice capital punishment tend to have the worst prison systems in general. But removing somebody from death row and placing them in general population, even in a maximum security prison, is something that is much better for the people who are on death row. Conditions on death row are, in most states, 23 hours a day solitary confinement. So it is an improvement for people to be placed in even the severe conditions in America's prisons than it is for them to be on death row.
Yeah. In terms of the shifting public attitude, is it mostly concerned with the possibility of wrongful conviction and the finite nature of capital punishment, or is it generally a revulsion against the state executing its own citizens?
Well, actually, it's a combination of factors. That's a really good question. What we've seen is that there isn't any single reason that people are moving away from capital punishment. There are the traditional arguments that we see being advanced by people who support social justice and equitable enforcement of the laws, saying that the death penalty is employed in an arbitrary and discriminatory way. And there is now 45 years of evidence that shows that that's in fact correct, that there are great geographic disparities in the use of the death penalty, and there are racial disparities as well. But we're also seeing many new groups beginning to voice opposition to the death penalty. Among America's conservatives, we see growing opposition to capital punishment. There are fiscal conservatives who say they are opposed to the death penalty because it costs too much and it doesn't work. We now have 45 years of data that shows that the death penalty is not a deterrent to murder. The states that have the death penalty also continue to have the highest murder rates. The death penalty does not make police officers safer. The rate at which police officers are murdered is continuously higher in states with the death penalty than states that don't have the death penalty. So we're seeing a practical opposition to the death penalty. People who support it in principle, but say that the death penalty as it's being applied is not something that they can defend. We're seeing more people who are libertarian saying, I don't trust the government to regulate shoelaces or fix potholes. Why should we trust them to take a human life? We're seeing growing opposition among people who consider themselves pro-life. It used to be that you would have some devout Catholics saying that they oppose the death penalty on pro-life grounds. Now you're seeing that expanded much more broadly. And with 166 people wrongly convicted and sentenced to death and subsequently exonerated, the people who used to say, well, I'm pro-life, but the people on death row have forfeited their right to live, we're seeing less and less of that. So it's a broad combination of things, running from economics to pro-life to civil rights. And there's a growing argument that the death penalty also just doesn't work for victims, because the single most likely outcome of a capital case in the United States, once the death penalty is imposed, is that the death sentence gets overturned in the courts. So family members of surviving victims have the wounds from that murder, the emotional wounds from that murder, reopened over and over again over a course of decades, with the net result in most of those cases being that the person who is initially sentenced to death doesn't end up being executed. All of these factors have come together, so people are more and more moving away from death penalty in this country.
In the American case, isn't it true that a lot of people don't realize that America is alone among Western democracies in upholding the death penalty?
I think that's true. The American public doesn't know what the law is in other countries, and for the most part, the people who support the death penalty think that other countries shouldn't be telling the United States what to do. I think that's a common belief that you have, not just in the United States, but in countries around the world where there are practices that other countries say violate international human rights standards. You see that the most ardent supporters are actually inflamed by international opposition to their practices. I think in the United States, the public as a whole doesn't know what the rest of the world is doing, and the strongest supporters of the death penalty here don't care.
You mentioned the conservative position on this. Conservatives are more likely to be hardline pro-capital punishment people, and yet the paradox is that they have more in common with the old communist regimes than with other modern democracies. Every communist regime in Europe changed to abolish capital punishment when they became democracies.
Well, I don't think that that argument is something that anybody in the United States would buy into. They do not. The United States does not view the death penalty as an issue of democracy versus communism. They don't view the death penalty as an issue of democracy versus fascism. The fact of the matter is the United States has its own history with capital punishment, and it has nothing to do with communism. But the history in the United States that's more troublesome is that the death penalty here has an inexorable link to our legacy of slavery and lynching and racially discriminatory laws. It's clear that the states that have a history of slavery are the ones that are more actively imposing the death penalty, are the ones that are more discriminatorily imposing the death penalty, and are the ones that are actually carrying out executions. Most of the executions in the United States take place in just 5 states, and those are all states that were slave states. Those are all states that had significant histories of lynching, and those are all states that had significant history of discriminatory laws after slavery was abolished and after lynching was prohibited.
There's obviously a socio-economic factor in this too. You talked about the people most likely to receive capital punishment. Obviously, they are at a disadvantage. They're probably left to get $100 a day hack lawyers or something like that, and they don't get the same fair deal in court as somebody with the means to have proper defense.
I think what we're seeing most recently in the United States, especially with the people who are being executed these days, is that the folks who are being executed are not the worst of the worst offenders who committed the worst of the worst crimes. They tend to be the most vulnerable criminal defendants, the poorest who received the worst representation, the people who are the most mentally ill or intellectually disabled, or had the greatest history of trauma, and so have difficulty making rational judgments in periods of stress. So we're seeing that it's the most vulnerable defendants and those who receive the worst in the way of legal process who are getting sentenced to death and who are being executed. There's an expression that we hear frequently, and I think it was first coined by Sister Helen Prejean, which is it's called capital punishment because if you've got the capital, you don't get the punishment. And we see that virtually everybody who is on death row in the United States is poor. Virtually everybody who is on death row was represented by a court-appointed lawyer. And in the states that have good systems of indigent defense, the states that have good public defender systems, we have very few people who get sentenced to death. In the states and counties that have very poor representation for the poor, you have a much greater use of the death penalty and is returned much more frequently.
And now those 29 retaining states, mostly they're using lethal injection, is that right?
That's right. Every state that still has the death penalty has lethal injection as its method of execution. Several have recently adopted alternate forms of execution, alternate methods of execution. But the one that several of the states have said they're going to, lethal gas, they have yet to come up with an acceptable method for going forward with that. We've also seen recently in Tennessee that several death row prisoners have opted to be executed by the electric chair instead of by lethal injection, because the recent controversy over lethal injection has led to court proceedings in which it's become clear that the 3-drug process that's commonly used by most states doesn't render the prisoner unconscious and keep him unconscious when the killing drugs are administered. It's been likened to a system of suffocation, waterboarding, and exposure to chemical fire. And so recently, 3 prisoners in Tennessee opted to be executed by the electric chair instead of lethal injection. Their reasoning wasn't that the electric chair wasn't torturous, it's that 1 minute or 2 minutes of torture was less problematic for them than being subjected to a potential extended period of 18 to 25 minutes in which they are conscious and aware of being suffocated and being, as one of the United States Supreme Court justices said, chemically burned at the stake.
And in the case of lethal injection, you have to have somebody with some degree of medical knowledge participating, and executions generally are overseen by medical professionals, aren't they?
No, it's unethical for medical professionals to participate in executions. What you have now is non-medical personnel carrying out executions, and you need appropriate training to be able to insert an intravenous line. What's interesting, what's troubling in capital cases is not just that you have non-medical personnel performing this procedure, but also that for a substantial number of death row prisoners, you have folks who don't have ready access to their veins. You have a substantial number of prisoners who were intravenous drug abusers, and their veins are simply have collapsed. They're not available for intravenous needles. You have an aging death row population that has a range of different kinds of ailments that make it more difficult to access a vein. And so with this population in which it's more difficult to find an appropriate vein to insert an execution line, you have people who are not medically trained trying to do that. And that results in a number of botched executions. It's estimated that about 7% of lethal injection executions are botched. Typically, those are problems finding a vein. And on top of that, recently, we've had states switching to inappropriate drugs to carry out executions. So you have reactions to the executions that are much more pronounced than they were when more appropriate drugs were being employed.
And the added factor, too, of some countries refusing to export to the United States certain drugs that are going to be used in the execution process.
And I think that's an important development, because in the United States, there is not a single major pharmaceutical manufacturer who is willing to sell its drugs to states to carry out executions. So when states are trying to get the drugs, they've been doing so through subterfuge or from in some circumstances, flat out misleading companies what they're buying the drugs for. Some states have actually said that the drugs were being sent to medical facilities or were being sent to the state mental health office, and then once they were purchased, they diverted those drugs from medical use to prisons to carry out executions. It's also illegal under United States law to import medicines for non-medical purposes. The medicines have to be properly labeled. They have to be sent to the United States for an approved medical purpose. And killing prisoners has never been an approved medical purpose. The European Union has adopted human rights regulations that say it cannot sell drugs or other execution supplies. You can't sell guillotines or guillotine parts to the United States or any other country for use in executions. So we're seeing a combination of the American pharmaceutical companies opting out of this practice, other countries enforcing their human rights laws, saying they will not participate in this practice, and then states trying desperately to come up with drugs from whatever sources they can.
Now, you have states, I believe Washington is one of them, where euthanasia is now legal. So how come you can have a peaceful death under euthanasia, but you can't use the same drugs for a peaceful death in the death row?
Well, you're assuming, that question assumes that an involuntary death is going to be a peaceful death. Euthanasia is permitted in very few states in the United States. And where it is permitted, it is under fairly strict medical supervision. So there is a vast difference between a medically induced death that is carried out for the benefit of the person who is dying and at the wishes of the person who is dying. There's a vast difference between that and somebody who is being put to death against their will using a medical procedure that's administered by non-medical personnel.
Yeah.
The two things are at polar opposites of the medical spectrum.
Yes, but there have been instances, haven't there, where doctors have presided over the death chamber. And in fact, in a survey a few years ago, I remember the American Medical Association found that a surprising number of their members were okay about capital punishment.
There has been some physician participation. In Missouri, there was a doctor who had been sued more than 24 times for malpractice, who was involved in executions. There is controversy in North Carolina right now over whether physicians can participate in any manner in executions. The medical board says that doctors should not be used in executions, and the state legislature was considering exempting doctors from their ethical oath to permit them to participate. But as a general matter, doctors do not participate actively in executions in the United States. Now, there will be doctors who are present to pronounce death, but in most states, doctors do not participate in executions.
Looking at the situation globally, Robert, are we seeing moves towards abolition, or is capital punishment pretty stable? We know, for example, in China, probably there are more executions than anywhere else, but we don't have access to figures, do we?
No, the Amnesty International does an annual report on the use of the death penalty around the world. Consistently, China is the world's most prolific executioner. We don't know what those numbers are. It's considered a state secret, but the estimate is that we're talking about thousands of prisoners being executed probably every year. The United States has consistently ranked among the most prolific 5 or 6 countries when it comes to executions. But in the last several years, the country has dropped down on the list. I think we were 8th or 9th in the world last year. But we consistently see countries like China, Yemen, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, high on the list of those who are carrying out executions. And it's one of those things that makes you wonder, because countries are often judged by the company that they keep. And the human rights record of the companies that perform so many executions has not been very good. This has been something that has been embarrassing to the United States State Department for years, because the country that claims to have invented the concept of universal human rights is now finding that it has difficulty trying to get countries whose human rights record is very poor to obey international human rights law. Once they try to enforce human rights elsewhere, the response is, well, you have the death penalty. When you address that problem, then maybe you can start telling us how we should be behaving towards our citizens. So, the death penalty is a problem for the United States internationally. It is the only Western democracy that still has the death penalty. It's the only Western democracy that has carried out executions in recent years. And the United States and Japan are the only 2 industrialized nations, leading industrialized nations, that still allow capital punishment.
Well, also, it relates to foreign policy, doesn't it, where Washington has championed regimes that are undemocratic and have been very prolific in their capital punishment record.
I think the current administration's human rights record has not been very good, and it has the administration is said to have favored much more authoritarian governments than any prior American presidency has. I think that's true, and a lot of the policies that we've been seeing advocated in the United States on subjects such as the death penalty and immigration also have an authoritarian feel to them. I think that that is something that is a function of this particular administration. I don't think it represents any long-term change in American policy. We'll find out if that's the case with the next presidential election. But as things stand right now, the current U.S. federal government is an outlier in the United States when it comes to the death penalty. Its death penalty practices diverge from those of most of the states in the United States, and they diverge sharply from the policies of prior federal administrations, both Democratic and Republican.
So what are we going to need to see a real shift in worldwide attitudes to capital punishment? We're going to need to have less authoritarian societies, and this is a time when there's creeping authoritarianism in most societies. The winds seem to be generally against any abolition of capital punishment.
Well, I think the winds are going in both directions at the same time. We are seeing the death penalty repealed and not used in more and more countries. There were a record number of countries last time in the United Nations who voted in favor of a global moratorium on executions. At the same time that that's the case, countries that are using the death penalty are using it in some instances more. So we are seeing in the Middle East a greater use of capital punishment, with the exception of Iran, who has amended its drug laws so that substantially fewer people can be subject to capital punishment for drug charges. I mean, what I think it really comes down to is that the death penalty is used more in periods of fear and uncertainty. And with the rising global uncertainty, with the kinds of social upheaval that you're likely to see with increased global warming, and the migration of people from one country that is geographically disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged to other countries. The instability that comes with that also brings with it rise in nationalism. Nationalism is a xenophobic phenomenon, and the death penalty tends to be associated with that as well. When you have countries that are trying to interfere in democratic elections, that brings instability as well. And so the attempts to destabilize democratic systems also tends to energize nationalist and other kinds of divisive politics. Those are all things that we have to take seriously when we're looking at not just the death penalty, but social policies in general. And I think that the rise of nationalism is a problem unto itself. It carries with it the greater chance of the use of capital punishment. But it is something that needs to be addressed and resolved whether or not capital punishment is at issue.
Right. Well, a number of those points that you made do hark back to our global economic orthodoxy, where we have people shifting across borders, and if you have a total free market system where the borders have to be removed for the free flow of capital, inevitably it will be for the free flow of people as well. Our economic system as we have it globally now is also creating greater rich-poor gaps which lead to social unrest. Aren't we talking about looking at fundamentals if we're to get the death penalty situation right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the death penalty is present. It tends to be present less in more open and more democratic societies, but it is not. It is not a product of any particular economic or political system. The death penalty is more about social control, and whoever has power in whatever country, whatever the nature of the system is going to exercise it in a way in which those in power can retain their power. Whether it's a communist country, whether it's a fascist country, whether it's a country that has an oligarchy, whether it's a democratic country, there are unique local political factors that come into play. The death penalty is a form of the death penalty is a criminal justice policy that may be used as an instrument of social control, which is why it tends to be used in a manner that is disproportionately applied to opposition groups or to groups that are less favored in society. But the death penalty is not a product of any particular economic structure.
Robert, thank you very much for your time. We've obviously touched on some points of optimism there. Cautious optimism, would that be a good way of explaining your position?
Well, the Death Penalty Information Center doesn't take a position for or against capital punishment. We provide information and analysis on the subject. I think that in most of the United States, the country is moving away from capital punishment. In most of the world, in most of the countries of the world, there is movement away from capital punishment. But we're at a pretty risky period right now, and there are pockets of resistance to the death penalty reform. There are global movements and local movements that are based in nationalism and fear that threaten to bring back the death penalty into greater usage than we've seen recently. So I think that we are at some kind of turning point. There is some kind of world climate change going on with capital punishment. And when there are major changes, things can get hairy. When there are major changes, things can get volatile. And I think we're in a period of volatility here. The long-term trends appear to be moving away from capital punishment, but that could all be swept aside if we have a huge growth in nationalism. So I think we're at a turning point, and we can't say which direction we're going, but there is cause for optimism. There is cause to believe that the death penalty is on its way out in many countries. And if we can get through this period of nationalism and political and social hatred, we may well see a period in which the world has outgrown capital punishment. We could regress. We could move forward. We don't know which way we're going to go.
Robert Dunham, Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Center in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.